The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and gun smoke across the dusty streets of El Paso as Henry Walker slumped against the weathered hitching post outside Taylor's General Store. His calloused hands trembled slightly as he rolled a cigarette, a habit he'd picked up in the years since losing Margaret and little Susan. The border town had changed since he'd last passed through, more desperate faces, more hollow eyes staring out from beneath wide-brimmed hats. The Mexican border brought its own breed of lawlessness, but lately something darker had taken root. The sound of boots scuffing dirt drew his attention to a boy, no more than 10, with a shock of unkempt dark hair and clothes that had seen better days. The child's eyes held that same haunted look Henry recognized from his own reflection, though there was a fierce determination there too. The boy planted himself directly in Henry's path, thin shoulders squared despite his obvious hunger. "Mister," he said, voice steady despite his ragged appearance, "I need your help, just for one day." Henry studied the boy, noting the careful way he held himself, like someone used to dodging blows. In another life, he might have walked right past, but something in the child's stance reminded him painfully of Susan. "What kind of help?" he asked gruffly, though he already knew he'd regret getting involved. The boy, who introduced himself as Charlie, explained that he needed an adult to help him access the town records office. The simple request set off warning bells in Henry's mind. The records office was run by Frank Moore, El Paso's deputy sheriff, a man whose reputation for misplacing important documents was well known among those who paid attention. Henry had crossed paths with Moore before, during his own search for answers about the fire that had taken his family. The deputy's carefully crafted explanations had never sat right, but proving anything in a town where law enforcement protected their own was nearly impossible. Charlie's request stirred memories Henry had spent years drowning in whiskey. The boy spoke of missing papers, of overheard conversations between Moore and other deputies about cleaning house before the territorial governor's upcoming visit. Most telling was the silver locket Charlie wore, a piece Henry himself had given Margaret on their wedding day, its distinctive engraving unmistakable even at a distance. His heart thundered in his chest as pieces of a puzzle he'd long abandoned began shifting into new configurations. The town around them buzzed with its usual afternoon activity. Merchants hawking wares, horses stomping in their stalls, the distant whistle of the afternoon train. But Henry's world had narrowed to the boy before him, and the impossible questions his presence raised. "Where did you get that locket?" he managed to ask, voice rough. Charlie's hand flew to the silver pendant, eyes widening with a mix of fear and defiance. "It was my mother's," he said, "before the fire." Henry's mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Margaret and Susan had died in that fire. He'd seen the bodies himself. Or had he? The memories of that night were clouded by smoke and grief, and Frank Moore had been surprisingly insistent about handling the burial arrangements personally. The deputy's other corruptions were well known to those who looked closely enough. Missing evidence, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories, deeds that vanished from official records. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as Henry made his decision. One day, he agreed, though they both knew it would be more. Charlie's relief was visible, but there was something else in his expression, a knowing look that suggested he'd chosen Henry specifically. "The records office closes at sunset," the boy said, "but Moore keeps his own copies in a strongbox at home. I've seen him taking papers there after hours." As they walked toward the more respectable part of town where the deputy lived, Henry's mind cataloged changes he hadn't noticed before. New buildings had sprung up on land that had previously belonged to families who'd mysteriously decided to move on. Moore's house itself was surprisingly grand for a deputy's salary, its whitewashed walls and manicured garden speaking of wealth that didn't match his position. Henry felt the weight of his revolver against his hip, a comfort he'd carried since his days as a Texas Ranger, another life he'd left behind after losing his family. Charlie walked beside him, matching his stride with the determination of someone used to keeping up with adults. The boy's presence stirred protective instincts Henry had thought long dead, along with questions that burned like whiskey in his throat. Whatever truth lay in Moore's strongbox, Henry knew this one day would change everything. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Moore's street as Henry and Charlie crouched behind a weathered oak fence. The deputy's house loomed before them, its pristine appearance now seeming more sinister than impressive. Henry studied the building's layout, noting the side entrance that Moore's housekeeper used and the partially open window on the ground floor. His years as a ranger had taught him to observe such details, though he never thought he'd use those skills again in this way. Charlie fidgeted beside him, his small hands clutching the tin star he'd found, the very badge that had once belonged to Henry's own son Daniel. The coincidence was too precise to be chance, and Henry's mind raced with possibilities he'd spent years trying to forget. The official report had claimed his family perished in the fire that consumed their home in El Paso, but he'd always suspected there was more to the story. "Mr. Henry," Charlie whispered, his voice barely audible above the evening breeze, "I remember something else about the papers. They had a seal on them, like the one in the courthouse, and there was a name, Margaret." Henry's breath caught in his throat. Margaret had been his wife's name, and hearing it from Charlie's lips sent a chill through his weathered frame. The boy couldn't have known that name by chance. The street had grown quiet as dusk approached, with only the distant sounds of piano music from the saloon breaking the silence. Henry noticed Moore's horse wasn't tied at its usual spot, suggesting the deputy was still at his office. It was now or never. He turned to Charlie, seeing determination in those young eyes that reminded him painfully of Daniel. "Listen carefully," Henry instructed, his voice low and serious. "You're going to walk up to the front door and ask the housekeeper, Martha, if she needs help with any errands. She knows you from church, right?" Charlie nodded, understanding blooming on his face. "While you keep her occupied, I'm going to find that strongbox. If anything seems wrong, you give a whistle like we practiced." The boy's face showed no fear, only the same quiet resolve he'd demonstrated since their paths crossed 2 days ago. Henry watched as Charlie straightened his worn jacket and walked casually toward the house's front entrance. The sight of the small figure moving with such purpose made his chest tighten with both pride and worry. As Charlie engaged Martha in conversation, Henry slipped around to the side of the house. The partially open window led to Moore's study, just as Charlie had described. Years of hard living hadn't diminished Henry's ability to move silently, and he eased himself through the opening with the practiced grace of a man who'd done similar things in his ranger days. The study was meticulously organized, unlike Moore's cluttered office at the jail. Henry's eyes swept the room, noting the heavy oak desk, the wall of leather-bound books, and most importantly, the safe built into the wall behind a painting of Dodge City's Main Street. The painting itself was a recent addition, probably commissioned to hide the safe's presence from casual visitors. Henry's fingers traced the frame, finding the hidden latch Charlie had mentioned seeing Moore use. The painting swung away silently, revealing the safe's dial. As he pressed his ear to the cold metal, working the combination with careful precision, Henry's mind wandered to the last time he'd seen Margaret and Daniel. They'd been planning a trip to Cheyenne, a fresh start away from the dangers of his work. Now, years later, he wondered if that planned escape had set in motion events he was only beginning to understand. The safe's mechanism clicked softly, and Henry eased the door open. Inside, neat stacks of papers and several leather pouches filled the space. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the documents, knowing that whatever he found could shatter the fragile peace he'd built around his grief. The first folder he opened contained land deeds, all bearing Moore's signature as witness, but it was the second folder that made his blood run cold. There, written in precise legal handwriting, was a document detailing the transfer of property from the estate of Margaret and Daniel Watson to Robert Moore, dated 3 months after the fire that had supposedly claimed their lives. Henry's vision blurred as he read further, discovering evidence of a carefully orchestrated deception that had torn his family apart and sent him spiraling into years of aimless wandering. Henry's hands shook as he shoved the damning documents into his vest. The sound of boots on wooden planks echoed from the street outside Moore's office, and he quickly closed the safe, his mind racing with implications. The transfer papers proved what he'd suspected during those dark days after the fire. His family's death had been staged, and Moore, the town's supposedly upright lawman, had orchestrated it all. Through the window, he caught glimpses of townsfolk hurrying past in the fading light of dusk. Cheyenne's main street was beginning to empty as workers headed home, which meant he had precious little time before Moore returned from his evening rounds. Henry slipped out the back door, careful to leave everything else as he'd found it, his thoughts turning to the boy he'd encountered earlier that day. The child had approached him outside the saloon, dirty-faced and wearing clothes several sizes too large. "Mister, would you adopt me for just a day?" Henry Walker squinted against the harsh afternoon sun as he followed the boy through the winding back alleys of El Paso. The kid, who'd only given his name as Charlie, moved with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years dodging trouble in these narrow passages. Henry's weathered boots scraped against loose stones, his spurs jingling softly as he tried to keep pace with the nimble child who'd so unexpectedly inserted himself into his life just hours ago. The boy stopped abruptly at a crooked wooden door set into a crumbling adobe wall, casting a furtive glance over his shoulder. "Marshal Frank Anderson comes through here sometimes," Charlie whispered, his small hand trembling as he pushed the door open. "But he ain't looking for lost kids. He's meeting with men who pay him to look the other way." The words carried a weight far beyond the boy's apparent years. Inside, Henry's eyes adjusted to find a cramped storage room filled with dusty crates and the musty smell of forgotten merchandise. But what caught his attention was a small tin box Charlie pulled from behind a loose board. The boy's fingers worked at the rusty latch, and Henry's breath caught in his throat as he saw what lay inside. A delicate silver locket he'd given his wife Margaret years ago, before the raid that had torn his family apart. "Where did you get this?" Henry's voice was barely more than a whisper, his calloused fingers hovering over the precious metal as memories flooded back. Charlie's eyes widened at the man's reaction, clearly not expecting such intensity. "A lady gave it to me last year, said to keep it safe until I found someone who'd recognize it. She was headed north to Deadwood, but..." Before Charlie could finish, heavy boots sounded in the alley outside. Marshal Frank Anderson's voice carried through the thin walls, accompanied by another man's lower tones discussing shipments and payments. Henry pulled Charlie into the shadows behind a stack of crates, his hand instinctively resting on the worn pearl handle of his Colt as he listened to the corruption playing out mere feet away. The conversation outside grew heated, with Anderson demanding more money from someone named Robert Clark. "The arrangements we made ain't good enough anymore," the marshal growled. "Times are changing, and my silence is worth double what it was." Henry felt Charlie trembling beside him, and he squeezed the boy's shoulder reassuringly while straining to hear every word. As the voices faded, Henry's mind raced with possibilities. The locket meant Margaret might still be alive, and this corrupt marshal might be connected to the raid that had separated them. Charlie seemed to sense the change in Henry's demeanor, watching as the older man's face hardened with determination. "You're going after them, aren't you?" the boy whispered. "I want to help. I know all their hiding places." That evening, Henry sat in his room at the Taylor boarding house studying the locket while Charlie dozed in a chair. The boy had drawn detailed maps of Anderson's movements through El Paso, marking meeting spots and times with remarkable precision. But it was the carefully folded paper hidden inside the locket that truly set Henry's hands shaking. A letter from Margaret, dated just 6 months ago. The next morning brought Daniel Moore to their door, a deputy who'd worked with Henry years ago when they both wore badges. His face was grim as he studied the evidence they'd gathered. "Anderson's been running this game for years," Daniel explained, "but nobody's been able to prove it. Word is he's got connections all the way to Cheyenne, maybe even higher." The implications were clear. This went far beyond a corrupt local lawman. As they planned their next moves, Charlie revealed more about the woman who'd given him the locket. She'd been helping other women escape from something, or someone, moving them north along secret routes. The pieces were starting to fit together, painting a picture that made Henry's blood run cold. His wife hadn't just disappeared that night. She'd been taken, and Marshal Anderson knew exactly where she'd gone. Henry and Daniel spent the afternoon poring over old case files in the deputy's cramped office, dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. Charlie sat quietly in the corner, methodically cleaning the tarnished locket with a soft cloth Daniel had provided. The boy's dedication to the task reminded Henry painfully of Margaret's careful way with precious things. "Anderson's been clever about it," Daniel explained, spreading out a weathered map across his desk. "He's got safe houses scattered between here and Cheyenne, places where he can hold folks without anyone asking questions. But there's one spot that keeps coming up in witness statements, an old mission near the territorial line." His finger traced a route through desolate country where law and order held little sway. The sound of horses outside drew their attention, and Henry's hand instinctively moved to his gun as boots scraped on the wooden porch. Robert Anderson himself stepped through the door, flanked by 2 deputies Henry didn't recognize. The marshal's smile didn't reach his eyes as he surveyed the scattered papers. "Quite the investigation you've got going here, Daniel. Shame you didn't see fit to inform me." Charlie shrank further into his corner, the locket disappearing into his pocket as Anderson's gaze swept the room. Henry positioned himself between the marshal and the boy, noting how Daniel's shoulders had tensed. The air grew thick with unspoken threats and the weight of old betrayals. Just following up on some missing persons cases, Daniel replied carefully, but Anderson's laugh cut through the pretense. We both know what you're really after, Moore. Question is, are you ready for what happens when you start turning over rocks? Lots of snakes under there. His words carried the bite of steel beneath their casual delivery. After Anderson left, Henry watched Daniel's hands shake as he lit a cigarette. He's right about one thing. This goes deeper than we thought. There's a woman in Deadwood named of Martha who's been helping track these disappearances. She sent word last week about a group of women being moved north, including one matching Margaret's description. The revelation hit Henry like a physical blow. 6 years of wondering, of imagining the worst, and now hope mixed poisonously with rage. Charlie tugged at his sleeve, those two old eyes fixed on his face. The lady who gave me the locket, she mentioned Martha, said she was the only one who could be trusted up north. As twilight painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, they made their plans. Daniel would stay behind to watch Anderson's movements and gather what evidence he could. Henry and Charlie would head north toward Deadwood, following the trail that might finally lead to Margaret. But first they needed supplies and allies. In the gathering darkness, they made their way to a small house on the outskirts of town where Laura, Daniel's sister, had been quietly gathering intelligence on Anderson's operation for months. She listened gravely as they laid out what they knew, her fingers working steady at mending Charlie's worn jacket. You'll need help getting past his men at the crossing, Laura said, threading her needle by lamplight. Susan runs the way station there now. She can get word ahead to Martha if you're coming. But Anderson's got eyes everywhere between here and Deadwood. You'll have to move careful, especially with the boy. Charlie straightened at that, his chin lifting. I can take care of myself. Been doing it long enough. The quiet dignity in his voice made Henry's chest ache, remembering another child who'd never had the chance to grow up. He reached out, resting a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. We take care of each other now, Henry said softly, and felt Charlie lean almost imperceptibly into the touch. The locket lay between them on Laura's table, its tarnished surface reflecting the lamplight like a promise. Tomorrow they would ride north, toward answers that had eluded Henry for 6 long years. But tonight, in this moment, he had found something he thought he'd lost forever, the chance to be a father again. Dawn broke harsh and golden over the prairie as Henry and Charlie set out from Laura's homestead. The boy rode close beside him on a borrowed mare, the locket now secured safely in Henry's saddlebag. They'd agreed to avoid the main trails, taking instead the winding deer paths and dry creek beds that meandered north toward Deadwood. Henry kept one eye on the horizon and the other on Charlie, who sat his horse with the kind of ease that spoke of years in the saddle. Anderson's got deputies posted at most of the waterholes between here and the crossing, Henry explained as they picked their way through a narrow canyon. Former marshals mostly, men who traded their badges for his gold. The words tasted bitter. He'd worn a badge himself once, before Margaret and Daniel died, before he learned how deep the corruption ran in the territorial law. Charlie nodded, his young face grave. That's why Pa, my adopted Pa, Robert, he always said to trust no one in a badge. Said Anderson had turned the law wrong side out in these parts. The boy fell silent, ducking under a low-hanging branch. That's why they killed him, isn't it? Because he knew too much? Henry's hands tightened on his reins. Robert had been one of the few honest lawmen left, before Anderson's men ambushed him 3 months back. The same pattern. Good men who asked too many questions, ending up face down in the dirt. Like the accident that had claimed Margaret and Daniel's lives all those years ago, when Henry had first started investigating missing tax revenues and mysterious shipments crossing the territory. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly as they approached the first major obstacle. Serpent's Pass, a treacherous switchback trail that wound between towering rock walls. Henry drew rein, studying the cliff faces above. Perfect place for an ambush, but the alternative was 2 days extra ride exposed on open ground. We'll have to risk it, he murmured, more to himself than Charlie. But first, he pulled a small spyglass from his saddlebag, scanning the heights methodically. Henry Walker's weathered hands gripped the reins tighter as young Daniel rode beside him through the dusty outskirts of El Paso. The boy's grip on the silver locket, the one bearing the same intricate engravings as the pocket watch Henry had given his wife Margaret before that terrible night, made the old cowboy's heart thunder in his chest. 7 years of believing his family perished in the fire And now this vagrant child appears with an heirloom that could only have come from them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the border territory as Henry guided them toward the abandoned Taylor Ranch. He'd spent enough time tracking local lawmen's movements to know Sheriff Frank Clark would be looking for them both. The adoption papers Daniel had shown him earlier were clearly forged, and Henry suspected the corrupted law officer had more sinister reasons for wanting the boy than simple civic duty. Through broken conversation during their ride, Daniel revealed fragments of his past, living in an orphanage in Dodge City run by a stern woman named Martha Moore, until a kind-faced lady named Laura had briefly taken him in. The details were hazy, but the boy remembered Laura giving him the locket before she disappeared, telling him to keep it safe. Henry's mind raced with possibilities he dared not voice aloud. The abandoned ranch house loomed before them as dusk approached, its weathered walls holding secrets Henry needed to uncover. Inside, thick dust coated everything except recent boot prints leading to the cellar. Someone had been here recently. Daniel clutched Henry's sleeve as they descended the creaking stairs, the boy's other hand still wrapped protectively around the locket that had started this journey. In the cellar's dim light, Henry discovered a cache of documents, ledgers detailing Sheriff Clark's dealings with a network of corrupt officials trafficking children across the territory. Names and dates jumped out at him. Orphanages used as fronts, children sold to wealthy families or worse. His blood ran cold when he found Margaret's name listed as a witness eliminated 7 years ago. The fire had been no accident. A floorboard creaked overhead and Henry instantly doused their lantern, pulling Daniel into the shadows. Heavy footsteps descended, accompanied by the distinctive jingle of law badge and spurs. Sheriff Clark's voice carried through the darkness. "Come on out, Walker. We both know what that boy's carrying. Evidence that could destroy everything we've built. Hand him over, and maybe I'll let you walk away this time." Henry felt Daniel trembling beside him as memories crashed through his mind. Margaret's desperate late-night warnings about corruption she'd uncovered while working at the county office, the mysterious fires that had claimed other whistleblowers' homes, the nightmare of his own loss. Now, 7 years later, his wife's final investigation had found its way back to him through this boy's innocent request for a day of family. The cellar erupted in chaos as Clark's deputies stormed down the stairs. Henry shoved Daniel behind a stack of crates, drawing his revolver as bullets splintered wood around them. Through the gun smoke, he caught glimpses of familiar faces, men who'd posed as upstanding lawmen while profiting from unspeakable crimes, the very men who'd murdered Margaret to keep their secrets buried. Deputy Charlie Anderson's shot caught Henry in the shoulder, spinning him against the wall. But as he fell, his hand found a familiar shape in the dirt. Margaret's old derringer, lost the night of the fire, somehow preserved in this very cellar. The significance struck him like lightning. This had been one of their safe houses, a place where Margaret had stored evidence of the corruption she'd uncovered. She'd known somehow they'd need it someday. A child's scream pierced the gunfire as Clark grabbed Daniel, reaching for the locket. Henry's vision narrowed to a single point, the sheriff's hand on his boy's throat. The derringer cracked once, then twice. Clark's badge shattered, along with the corrupt power it represented. As the other deputies fled into the night, Henry gathered Daniel into his arms, finally allowing himself to see what his heart had known since morning. His son's eyes, Margaret's smile, a family thought lost but somehow found again. The derringer's smoke curled through Henry's trembling fingers as he cradled Daniel, the boy's heartbeat strong against his chest. Around them, the cellar's musty air carried echoes of the firefight, but Henry focused only on the weight of his son in his arms, a miracle he'd stopped believing in years ago. The locket lay open between them, its tiny photographs bearing silent witness to their reunion. Margaret's face smiled up at them both, preserved in sepia tones that seemed to glow in the dim light. Deputy Charlie Anderson slumped against the far wall, his wound minor but his spirit broken. "She knew, Henry," he wheezed. "Margaret figured out how deep it went. The land grabs, the murders, everything. That's why Clark wanted her silenced." The deputy's eyes fell on Daniel. The boy was never supposed to survive that night. Clark's men botched it, and when they couldn't find him. His voice trailed off into the darkness. Henry helped Daniel to his feet, noting how the boy's fingers instinctively curled around the familiar shape of his mother's locket. The cellar's shadows seemed to retreat as memories flooded back. Margaret's network of safe houses, her careful documentation of Clark's crimes, the way she'd always insisted on having an escape route. She'd been preparing for this, knowing someday the truth would need to surface. Now, through their son, she'd ensured it would. Outside, the night air carried the sound of hoofbeats. Reinforcements from the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne, summoned by Frank's last telegram before Clark's men had cut the lines. Henry guided Daniel up the cellar steps, each footfall stirring dust motes that danced in the moonlight streaming through the broken door. Behind them, Charlie struggled to his feet, his badge lying discarded in the dirt. The arriving marshals found a town in turmoil. Clark's remaining deputies had fled, but they'd left behind a trail of evidence. Ledgers documenting years of extortion, land deeds seized through violence, and letters that proved Margaret's suspicions had been right all along. In the sheriff's office, hidden behind a false wall, they discovered what she'd died protecting. Proof that Clark had been selling territorial justice to the highest bidder, using his badge to build an empire of corruption. Daniel's small hand remained firmly clasped in Henry's as they watched the marshal's work. The boy's eyes, so like his mother's, held a wisdom beyond his years. "She used to tell me stories about you," he whispered. "Said you were the only lawman who couldn't be bought. Said someday we'd find you again, when it was safe." Henry's throat tightened at the words, understanding now why Margaret had kept their son hidden, protected by a network of loyal friends across the territory. As dawn broke over the distant mountains, Henry and Daniel sat on the boardwalk outside the general store, sharing a quiet breakfast while the town slowly came back to life. The boy told stories of his years on the move, of kind strangers who'd sheltered him, of lessons learned in hidden rooms, of always keeping his mother's locket close. Each word filled in another piece of the puzzle, painting a picture of Margaret's desperate efforts to protect their child while gathering the evidence that would finally bring justice. Frank emerged from the telegraph office, his weathered face bearing good news. "Words spread to Deadwood and El Paso," he announced. "Clark's network is falling apart. Marshals are rounding up his men all along the border." He knelt before Daniel, offering a gentle smile. "Your mama would be proud, son." She never stopped believing this day would come. Henry watched as the morning sun caught the silver surface of Margaret's locket, now safely returned to their son's neck. The tiny catch that had given him such trouble yesterday now seemed like destiny's touch, a small mechanism that had kept its secrets until exactly the right moment. In its reflection, he saw not just the past they'd lost, but the future they'd found, a chance to be the father and lawman Margaret had always believed he could be. The territorial marshal, an old friend named Robert, approached with papers in hand. "We'll need your testimony, both of you," he said quietly. "But first, there's something else." He produced a document bearing the territorial seal. "Margaret filed these papers years ago in case anything happened to her. Legal guardianship, naming you, Henry. All it needs is your signature." The quill trembled in Henry's hand as he made their family whole again, not just for a day, but for all the days to come. The territorial office fell silent as Henry's signature dried on the papers, but the quiet was shattered by the sudden thunder of hoofbeats in the street. Through the dusty window, they saw a group of riders approaching. Former deputies who had worked under the corrupt sheriff, men who'd rather see their secrets buried than face justice. Henry instinctively moved to shield his newly reclaimed son, while Marshal Robert reached for his weapon. "Get to the back room," Henry commanded, his voice carrying the weight of years spent protecting others. The boy hesitated, clutching the locket that had brought them together. "Please, son. I can't lose you again." This time the word son carried no uncertainty, only fierce protection. Robert's deputy ushered the boy to safety while Henry and Robert took positions on either side of the door. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Deadwood's main street as townsfolk scattered for cover. Frank, the ringleader of the corrupt deputies, dismounted with an exaggerated casualness that barely masked his desperation. "Henry," he called out, his voice echoing off the weathered boardwalks. "That boy's got papers that don't belong to him. Papers that could hurt a lot of good people. Let's handle this quiet-like, for old time's sake." Henry exchanged glances with Robert, years of unspoken communication passing between them. Henry Anderson's hands trembled as he held the small tin locket, its dented surface catching the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the El Paso Saloon's grimy windows. The boy, Daniel, watched him with eyes that seemed far too old for his 10 years, waiting for the weathered cowboy to speak. Around them, The usual cacophony of the border town saloon had fallen eerily silent, as if the very air knew the weight of this moment. "This belonged to my Margaret," Henry finally managed, his voice rough as desert sand. "Had it made special in Dodge City before we set out for the border territories. There ain't but 3 like it in all the world. One for her, one for our boy Charlie, and one I kept close these past 7 years." His calloused thumb traced the distinctive pattern of crossed arrows that he himself had carved into each locket. Frank Clark, the corrupt deputy marshal who'd been watching from the shadows, shifted uneasily. He'd spent years building his empire of lies about that long-ago massacre, telling the townspeople how the Anderson family had been killed by Comanche raiders. The truth, that he and his men had attacked the homestead while Henry was away, believing Margaret knew too much about their smuggling operation, was a secret he'd killed to protect. Daniel pulled out a matching locket from beneath his ragged shirt. "The lady at the orphanage in Cheyenne said a woman named Margaret gave it to me before she died, said I should keep it safe until I found someone who'd recognize the marks." The boy's voice wavered but held steady, much like he had through years of searching, following whispered rumors of a grieving cowboy who never stopped looking for answers. Sheriff Robert Moore watched the scene unfold from his post by the bar, his conscience finally breaking under the weight of 7 years' silence. He'd been new to the badge back then, too green to stop Frank's schemes, but wise enough to help Margaret hide her son before the attack. He'd arranged for the boy's secret transport to Cheyenne, believing it was the only way to keep him safe from Frank's reach. "Your mother," Henry said, dropping to one knee before Daniel. "She was the bravest soul I ever knew. When she realized what Frank and his men were planning, she made sure you'd survive, and left a trail I could follow once I learned to read the signs." The old cowboy's eyes filled with tears he'd held back for 7 years, each one carrying the weight of endless searching. Martha Walker, the saloon owner who'd given Daniel work when he arrived in El Paso 2 weeks ago, moved to block the door as Frank reached for his gun. "You'll not be leaving, Mr. Clark," she said, her voice steel wrapped in silk. "Some debts need paying, and yours has been drawing interest far too long." Throughout the territory, she'd been quietly gathering evidence of Frank's crimes, waiting for this very day. The sound of horses outside announced the arrival of U.S. Marshal Susan Taylor, who'd been investigating corruption along the border for months. She'd followed the threads of Frank's operation from Deadwood to El Paso, building a case that would expose not just the deputy's crimes, but the entire network of corrupt officials who'd profited from 7 years of silence. Henry held his son close, feeling the boy's heartbeat strong against his chest. Around them, the truth began unfolding like a flower in desert rain. How Margaret had discovered Frank's smuggling operation, how she'd sacrificed herself to save their son, how a network of quiet heroes had kept Daniel safe until he could find his way home. The story was far from over, but its darkest chapters were finally coming to light. The setting sun painted El Paso's streets in shades of gold and shadow as justice, long delayed, finally arrived. Frank and his conspirators were led away in chains, while Henry and Daniel began the delicate work of becoming family again. Martha Walker watched them leave her saloon together, the boy clutching his father's hand, both carrying their matching lockets, symbols of a love strong enough to bridge 7 years of separation and silence. As word spread through the border territories, other stories emerged from the shadows. Tales of Margaret's courage, of quiet resistance against corruption, of hope preserved through years of darkness. In time, the Anderson story would become legend, whispered around campfires as proof that even in the wildest corners of the frontier, love and justice could find their way home. Henry and Daniel settled on a small ranch outside El Paso, close enough to town for Daniel to visit Martha Walker, who'd become something of a grandmother to him. Together, father and son began building a new life, their shared grief gradually giving way to joy as they discovered all the ways they were alike, from the way they sat a horse to how they both hummed old hymns while doing their chores. The 3 tin lockets, reunited at last, hung above their fireplace, a reminder of Margaret's sacrifice and the long road that had led them back to each other. And on quiet evenings, when the desert wind carried memories of harder times, Henry would tell Daniel stories of his mother's courage, keeping her memory alive in the heart of the son she'd died protecting. Years passed, and the Anderson ranch flourished under Henry and Daniel's care. The boy grew into a young man with his mother's gentle spirit and his father's unwavering determination. Their small spread became known as a haven for travelers and those in need, much like Martha Walker's boarding house had been in those darker days. Henry found peace in watching his son master the skills of ranching, though his eyes still carried shadows of the long years spent searching. One autumn morning, as dawn painted the Franklin Mountains in shades of amber and rose, a rider approached their gate. It was Frank Mitchell, grayer now but still wearing his marshal's badge. He'd finally retired from service in Dodge City and had tracked down Henry to deliver news that would close the final chapter of their shared past. The corrupt former sheriff, Robert Hayes, had been captured trying to cross into Mexico, carrying a fortune in stolen silver and a ledger full of names. Daniel, now 17, stood shoulder to shoulder with his father as Frank explained how Hayes' capture had led to the unraveling of an entire network of corrupted lawmen stretching from Deadwood to Cheyenne. The evidence Henry had gathered years ago, combined with Martha Walker's testimony, had been instrumental in bringing down the last remnants of Hayes' criminal empire. Justice, though delayed, had finally arrived on the frontier. That evening, as they shared a meal with Frank, Daniel brought out the wooden box, where they kept Margaret's letters, the ones Henry had discovered hidden in the third locket. Reading them together, they painted a picture of a woman who'd seen the darkness coming and had carefully laid plans to protect her son, trusting that love would eventually guide him back to his father. Her words, preserved through the years, revealed how she'd enlisted Martha's help and arranged for Daniel's escape through a network of trusted friends. The revelation of Margaret's foresight brought both pain and healing. Henry realized that his years of searching hadn't been in vain. They'd been part of her plan all along, keeping Hayes distracted while Daniel grew up safely hidden. The corruption that had threatened their family had ultimately been defeated by a mother's love and a father's persistence, their sacrifice creating ripples that helped clean up the lawless territories. As summer turned to fall, Daniel took to riding patrol along their property boundaries, often stopping to help travelers in need. He'd inherited his mother's gift for seeing goodness in others, combined with Henry's instinct for spotting trouble. Together, they built something rare on the frontier, a place where justice and compassion walked hand in hand. Martha Walker became a regular visitor to the ranch, her boarding house in El Paso now run by her niece. She'd watch Daniel working the land and smile, remembering the frightened boy who'd shown up on her doorstep years ago. The tin lockets above the fireplace had tarnished with time, but their significance only grew stronger, a testament to the love that had preserved a family through years of separation. One evening, as father and son sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the desert sky, Daniel spoke of his memories of Margaret, fragments of lullabies, and the scent of wildflowers in her hair. Henry listened, his heart full, knowing that their story had become something more than personal tragedy overcome. It had become a beacon of hope for others, proof that even in the darkest corners of the territory, love could light the way home. As the years rolled on, the Anderson Ranch became known as a place where lost souls could find their way, where justice was tempered with mercy, and where the spirit of Margaret lived on in the kindness shown to strangers. Henry and Daniel's story became interwoven with the larger tale of the frontier's transformation from lawless territory to civilized land. A reminder that change often begins with a single act of love carried forward through generations. The 3 tin lockets remained their most precious possession, not for the secrets they'd once held, but for the truth they represented. That family bonds, though tested by distance and darkness, could emerge stronger for the trials they'd endured. And in the end, that was Margaret's greatest legacy, the knowledge that love, properly planted and tended, could bloom even in the harshest desert soil.